A long gap then supervenes, full of poets who are all right, until we get to Mary Gilmore. I've always had a liking for Dame Mary. I nearly met her when I was in. I was supposed to go and meet her up. She was up at the Cross. She had a flat up at the Cross by that time, and the early 1960s. She died. She was born in 1865 and died in 1962. So she had a fair innings. She wrote a lot of stuff, and a lot of it was spoiled by being in an archaic sort of poetical language, you know, these and thous. And she wrote a lot of stuff in kind of mock Scotch and mock Irish, most of which was ruined by being in mock Scotch and mock Irish. You know, it wasn't the real article. But here and there amongst her productions, there were things that I think are absolutely marvellous. And while I was doing the research on it, I found a poem in somebody else's manuscript box. It was the manuscript box of John Shaw Nielsen's father, in fact. A poem by Mary and typed out by her with a blue ribbon in her typewriter, which, as far as I could find, has never been published. And I thought, well, you know, it's only 100 years later. I'll give it a go up now. I may read you that one in a minute, but this is called the rue tree. I know a rue is a plant, but whether it is a tiny plant or a tree, I don't know. But Mary didn't care. The rue tree. The rue tree is the tallest tree. None other is so tall. The rue tree is the smallest tree. None other is so small. But oh, where'er its dark head grows, one root is at the heart, and every man its sad fruit knows, or walks as one apart. There was a rue tree, had no leaf, but a crosspiece set above. On either hand there hung a thief, but at its heart was love. And judges walked behind a rue that grew a gallows tree, where they who followed after knew whose breath came piteously. And many a one in prison cell waters a rue tree there, and down his slow tears dropping will, and his sighs break on air. For the rue tree is the tallest tree, none other is so tall. The rue tree is the smallest tree, oh none so sad and small.
How do you spell rue?
I'm sorry?
How do you spell rue?
R-U-E. Yeah. Awakened. His eyes looked into mine, oh look that made me wise. I hid my own, although my world lay in his eyes. I turned away my face, my breath came like a sob, and to his heart my own gave answer, throb for throb. I could not raise my eyes, lest he should read therein, and trembled, woman-wise, and woman waked within. As the story goes with this one, read it first. 14 men. 14 men, and each hung down, straight as a log from his toes to his crown. 14 men, Chinamen they were, hanging on the trees in their pigtailed hair. Honest poor men, but the diggers said nay, so they strung them up on a fine summer's day. There they were hanging as we drove by, grown-ups on the front seat, on the back seat I. That was lambing flat, and still I can see the straight up and down of each on his tree. She did pretty well because the hangings of Chinese diggers at Lambing Flat in the so-called Lambing Flat riots happened about 5 years before her birth. And she's unlikely to have passed on that day. But it didn't spoil a good story. And now there's a wonderful Chinese garden down there to commemorate what really happened, which seems to have been a big riot, you know, but nobody killed. And I recommend the garden. I recommend the Cherries of Young and the Chinese Garden of Young. But Dame Mary was known to embroider the truth a bit occasionally. She was born in Wagga and had a father she obviously revered, an Ulsterman who was full of old poetry and stories and things, and who allegedly, she alleges, learned to speak Wiradjuri, the language of the Aborigines around there. And at least one good joke comes from there, one good sort of riposte comes from there. There was a person, some woman around there painting, showing the Aborigines her paintings. And they looked at him and they said, But these aren't people, these are pictures of clothes. There was just no answer to it. You know, this woman was painting in a style which Aborigines regarded, they were still wearing only the sky in those days, you know. These were pictures of clothes. She hated modernism, apparently, in poetry, although some of her poems actually do use a clear kind of modern diction, or what we call a modern diction, if you're being Broadchurch about modern. And I think that they tend to be her best poems. Like this one, The Thumb. Intellect, said one, is the world's builder, but from the prehistoric and the dumb came this, not intellect but memory. And lifting up its thumb it said, the first remembered movement made by this was man's first step toward the skies. This is what she thought of modernists. Eyes fixed they sit and stare, brooders, not even dreamers, seeking to bring gold from a shadow and fruit from a passing wind. Ours are the mountains of thought, they cry. In us dwells the all-comprehending mind. But only their own kind talk to them, or use their idiom. I suppose I come under that lash myself. Nationality. I have grown past hate and bitterness. I see the world as one. But though I can no longer hate, my son is still my son. All men at God's round table sit, and all men must be fed. But this loaf in my hand, this loaf is my son's bread. The pine tree is a king, he lifts high his steeple. But greater is the wheat is a people. And one that moves me a good deal is this one called Famous. He sat a leader and acclaimed by men, and all his heart was with the yellow corn. He saw the paddocks of his youth again, and weathered hut where he and his were born. And as he dreamed, he heard the wind blow up and down the tawny wheat, and marked the rustle, how it fell and thinned and died upon the wind in its retreat. He heard the milkers lowing at the rails, and saw his father rise and let them in. Caught the horns rattle on the closing bales, heard the first milking on the pail strike thin. The firelight leaped up behind his chiselled brass, a bell beside his polished table rang. He heard a troop of horses pass, the battered door of an old stable clang. Upon the wall the great companioned him. His heart was with a little barefoot lad, running to find a ferny brookside dim and checkered waters by a forest pad. There's a legend that Mary and Henry Lawson were engaged, and Henry went off to Western Australia looking for work, and Mary had been staying in the Lawson household. What was the Louisa Lawson was the his mother was in charge there, and Mary wrote letters to Lawson in West Australia, and he wrote back. And apparently Louisa put the letters up out of sight, and Mary never received them. So she thought that Henry had lost interest in her, and she instead went off to South America with the Paraguay colony. You know, that strange adventure in Paraguay of building the new Australia in the 1890s. And she came back from there only about 8 years later, having married a fellow called Gilmore. So the two of them never got together. And I suspect if that's true, if that story is true and not just a romantic yarn, that this poem may refer to it. Somehow we missed each other. Somehow we missed each other, passed each other by unknowing. I who sought you, you who sought me, with hearts that throb for hopes and fears, passed each other in the early going, missed each other in the early years. Somehow we missed each other, we two poor bankrupt souls, sowing a harvest that we recked not of. Now other sorrows claim our tears, others call us in our later going, others hold us in our later years. Maybe. Old Botany Bay. I'm old, Botany Bay, stiff in the joints, little to say. I am he who paved the way that you might walk at your ease today. I was the conscript sent to hell to make in the desert the living well. I bore the heat, I blazed the track, furrowed and bloody upon my back. I split the rock, I felled the tree, the nation was because of me. Old Botany Bay taking the sun from day to day. Shame on the mouth that would deny the knotted hands that set us high. She didn't always write in rhymed, neat stanzas. She sometimes wrote what I think are very good prose poems, mostly collected in two books called Old Days, Old Ways. And some of her footnotes that go with poems have the same sort of quality. I kept one of those as a sample. They all would have appeared, pretty well all would have appeared, I think, in the bulletin, although she published it in other places later. The kangaroos were patriarchal. They lived in family groups, so they fed in hundreds and at times in thousands on the plains and among the trees of the forests. I do not remember them ever bedding down in the open, but always under or near trees. The old man, as the blacks named him, standing sentinel to the last. I have never seen an old man kangaroo remove sticks before laying down. Perhaps his weight made it unnecessary. Or perhaps, like a man, he slept heavily and did not feel them. While the does, like women, slept lightly because of the young. But the does invariably lifted with their delicate hands even small twigs and tossed them away before lying down. If they felt one left under them, they would get up and look for it, throwing it away when it was found. And I think this is one of the great poems for the death of a little child. The little shoes that died. These are the little shoes that died. We could not keep her still. All day long her busy feet danced to her eager will. Leaving the body's loving warmth, the spirit ran outside. Then from the shoes they slipped her feet, and the little shoes died. That poem, Old Botany Bay, was written during the Second World War when the Japanese invasion seemed to be imminent. This is a poem in a different kind of measure called The Harvesters. I'll make this one the last one of hers I read to you. In from the fields they come to stand about the well, and drinking say, the tin gives taste, taking in turn the dipper from each other's hands. The dregs outflung as each one finishes. Then as the water in the oil drum bucket lowers, they tip that out to draw a fresher, cooler draught. And as the windlass slowly turns, they talk of other days, of quakes and noggins made of oak grown black with age, and on through generations, and old houses handed down to children's children, till at last, in scattered families, they are lost to ken. Yet even so the dipper tastes the best, they say. Then having drunk and sluiced their hands and faces, talk veers to fields and folk in childhood known, and names are heard of men and women long since dead or gone, because the spirit of adventure lured them from familiar scenes to strange and far. Of these old names, some will have been long unheard, and not all remember them. And yet a word its vision brings, and memory, wakened and eager, lifts anew the fallen thread, until it seems the past is all about them. Where they group, in two worlds they stand, a world that was, a world in making now. Then in a sudden hush the voices cease. The supper horn blows clear, and from community where all were one, each man withdraws his mind, as men will drop a rope in haulage held. And individuals in a sea of time in separateness they turn, and to the cookhouse go. Oh yeah, this one I forgot, called Bones in a Pot. It's a child's poem. She wrote quite a few children's poems. And this one's my favourite. Little Billy Button said he wanted mutton. Miss Betty Bly said she wanted pie. But young Johnny Jones said he wanted bones. Bones in a pot, all hot. In her long life, she was editor of the women's page of the communist paper, what was called the Tribune, and she sometimes wrote the same editorial for the Tribune and the Catholic Weekly. And she was a journalist all her life, really. And her adventures in South America were fascinating as well. Well worth looking into. That whole story, I think, is a fascinating story. Was there a hidden agenda about not telling the kids about Frank the Poet McNamara in schools? Maybe. I think he just he was kind of regarded as a bit of a communist property a few generations ago, or a few decades ago. You know, the communists made much of the idea that Australia had a folk civilisation, or folk tradition, a popular art and that sort of thing. And for that reason, it may have been avoided by other authorities. I think that was the best thing the communists did, actually, was retrieve a certain amount of stuff that would have been lost otherwise. And so we never heard about Frank the Poet. That's the point that Sue was making. We never heard about Frank the Poet in schools and universities. We heard about more respectable writers like Charles Harper, who God knows wasn't entirely respectable, the fiercely anti-monarchist for one thing. Henry Lawson wrote the most searing poem against the Queen ever penned by anybody in the British Empire. I enjoyed putting it in the Oxford Book of Australian Verse. It wasn't Queen Elizabeth, it was Queen Victoria, but you know. There was, you know, it's hard to trace these politics, and it's easy to make too much of them, but maybe.
Do you think it's possible that in Tasmania he found it harder to get basic things like...
I think what happened in Tasmania was that he was raped. There's evidence in a poem. I mean, God knows there's a lot of it went on in Australian, in the convict period. He gave a poem called Farewell to Tasmania. It's only 4 lines, and I think it gives you an idea. Farewell to Tasmania. Farewell, Tasmania's isle, I bid adieu the possum and the kangaroo. Farmer's glory, prisoner's hell, land of buggers, fare ye well. Yeah. There must have been a lot of it about, I think, but as there tends to be in jails. That's all I've heard. But, no, I think they probably broke your spirit down there. The convict system was intended to break your spirit. Eventually, you caved in somewhere. You know, if you could either put your head down and be a good boy and get a ticket to leave and so on, or stay defiant and they'd break you. I think that was the idea. There's 2 schools of thought about convicts. One's Professor Hurst's view that most convicts to Australia did very much better here than they would have done in the old country. They were much better fed. Their rations were much better than they would have had at home. And within 2 or 3 years, 4 years, they had a ticket of leave and they were effectively on their own, you know, started even being paid wages and that sort of thing. A few, on the other hand, a minority, were defiant and they were broken. Bob Hughes, in his book, what's it called, The Fatal Shore, concentrates on the gulag side of it, you know, the side of the floggings and the executions and the you know, the savage punishments. Both of them are true. I think both of these theories are true. Neither of them has the monopoly on truth. It certainly, if you gave them trouble, if you gave the authorities trouble, you sure got plenty of it back. My favourite John Shaw Nielsen's poem is the one that goes, there was a young lady called Brewster, in a hat wore the head of a rooster. Pray tell, does he crow? He can't do that, no. And pray tell, can he crow? And she replied, no, he can't do that now, but he used to. Yeah, there are a few I like, but he's the one. I know he's important. Occasionally you'll strike a poet who you know is important, and you're prepared to give them all the space they deserve, and yet you find your heart doesn't reach out to them. I've always found him difficult that way. My heart reaches out to him biographically. He had a hell of a time. I mean, he was effectively a blind man working in ferociously hard country labour, you know, digging digging gravel and road making and timber work and so on. He could never read after about the age of 30 because his eyes just gave out, and his friends used to have to write his poems down for him on, and so the poems were sent into the Bulletin. He published almost entirely in the Bulletin, and they'd come in with weird spellings, written by fellows who basically wrote with their thumbnail dipped in tar, and went into the Bulletin. He was a son of a Scottish family. The father seemed to have been very poetical as well, and his mother, on the other hand, was very fiercely Presbyterian and believed a lot in hellfire, and he had a great fear of God, great God, the punitive kind of God of Calvinism, which he had to struggle with a lot. But I was going to tell you a bit about this even less well-known poet, Lesbia Harford, who was born at Lesbia Keogh, and the first and obvious, altogether too obvious, biographical note about her was that she was Lesbia by name and by nature. She had women and men lovers, and had no objection to writing about it. Back there in the early 20th century, when these things were a big, big no-no, she wrote about it, and nobody seems to have cared a farthing about it. And she finally married a fellow called Harford, who was became a failed painter and an alcoholic, but she kept his surname. There's a very moving poem here about sometimes how you have to keep secrets, and about a man killed in the First World War. Ours was a friendship in secret, my dear. Ours was a friendship in secret, my dear, stolen from fate. I must be secret still, show myself calm, early and late. Isn't it sad he was killed, I must hear, with a smooth face? Yes, it is sad. Oh, my darling, my own, my heart of grace. Someone brought in lilac, lilac after rain. Isn't it strange, beloved of mine, you'll not see it again? Lilac, glad with the sun on it, flagrant, fair from birth. Morns in colour, beloved of mine, you laid in the earth. Day's End. She was one of the first graduates, women law graduates from Melbourne University. But she, being a fiercely loyal socialist, she believed she should work in humble work, and she worked in the rag trade, in weaving and dressmaking and things, and breathed a lot of lint, and it had very bad effects on her lungs. And she died young in her 30s. This is one poem about work. The Invisible People. When I go into town at 7:30, great crowds of people stream across the ways, hurrying, though it's only 7:30. They are the invisible people of the days. When you go into town about 11, the hurrying morning crowds are hid from view. Shut in the silent buildings at 11, they toil to make life meaningless for you. Closing time, public library. At 10 o'clock the great gong sounds its dread prelude to splendour. I push back my chair and all the people leave their books. We flock, still acquiescent, down the marble stair into the dark where we can't read. And thought swoops down insatiate through the starry air. Machinist song. The foot of my machine sails up and down upon the blue of this fine lady's gown. Sail quickly, little boat, with gifts for me. Night and the goldy streets and liberty. Fatherless. Her father ran away from the family when she was a baby. She never heard much from him at all. I've had no man to guard and shelter me, guide and instruct me from mine infancy. No lord of earth to show me day by day what things a girl should do and what she should say. I have gone free of manly excellence, and hold their wisdom more than half pretence. For since no male has ruled me or has fed, I think my own thoughts in my woman's head. To look across at Moira. To look across at Moira gives me pleasure. She has a red tape measure. Her dress is black and all the workroom is dreary, and I am weary. But that's like blood, like a thin bloodstream trickling, like fire quickening. It's revolution. Oh, hey, I take pleasure in Moira's red tape measure. Yeah. So, some very wise poems about love in here too. I'm just trying to find a sample of one. I like this one. When I am articled, which is studying the law. When I am articled, the law decrees I shall devote my time to stating fees and learning about action, suits and courts. Then deeds and briefs and grants must fill my thoughts. While if a naughty little verse should find its way into a corner of my mind, I must not tell the chap for whom I work. He pays the penalty if I should shirk and take to writing books of verse instead of hereinafter, duly, viz., the said. She was working for Lady Fairfax at one time. She came up from Melbourne to Sydney and was working as a house servant. A parlourmaid. I want a parlourmaid. Well, let me see. If you were God, what kind of maid she'd be? She'd be tall, she'd be fair, she would have slender limbs, a delicate air, and yet for all her beauty she would walk among my guests unseen, and through their talk her voice would be the sweet voice of a bird, not listened to, though heard. And now I know the girl you have in mind. Tell me her duties, if you'll be so kind. Why, yes, she must know names of wines and never taste them, must handle fragile cups and never break them, must fill my rooms with flowers and never wear them, must serve my daughter's secrets and not share them. Madam, you are no God, that's plain to see. I'll just repeat what you have said to me. You said your maid must look in Helen fashion, golden and white, and yet her loveliness inspire no passion, give no delight. Your intimate goods of home must owe their beauty to this girl's care, but she'll not overstep her path of duty nor seek to share. Though loving or enjoying or through loving or enjoying or possessing the least of them. Why, she's not human, by your own confessing, and you condemn your rational self in every word you're speaking. Please understand, you'll find the hollow maiden you are seeking in fairyland. Inventory. We've a room that we call home with a bed in it, and a table and some chairs, A to Z in it. There's a mirror and a safe and a lamp in it. Were there more, our mighty love might get a cramp in it. This is the one I was looking for. It's called I'm Like All Lovers. I'm like all lovers, wanting love to be a very mighty thing for you and me. In certain moods your love should be a fire that burnt your very life up in desire. The only kind of love then, to my mind, would make you kiss my shadow on the blind and walk 7 miles each night to see it there, myself within, serene and unaware. But you're as bad. You'd have me watch the clock and count your coming while I mend your sock. You'd have my mind devoted day and night to you and care for you and your delight. Poor fools, who each would have the other give what spirit must withhold if it would live. You're not my slave, I wish you not to be. I love yourself and not your love for me. The self that goes 10,000 miles away and loses thought of me for many a day. And you love me for loving much beside, but now you want a woman for your bride. Oh, make no woman of me, you who can, or I will make a husband of a man. By my unwomanly love that sets you free, love all myself, but least the woman in me. I think that's a wise one somehow. So, having failed to ask questions, you wisely so got yourselves a third poet. Thank you for your attention.